We had this BRICS summit and 6 new members of BRICS. What's the importance, in your opinion, of this BRICS summit?
Well, it was a very revealing expansion of BRICS. When you add to Russian energy capability, the oil supply of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, you have a very large percentage of the world energy right there, represented into what is 11 or 12 BRIC countries. So, and the fact that the Saudis are willing to join with the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese is an indication that they don't regard their alliance with the United States in the same way that they did formerly. In other words, it's a form of repudiation of Washington, which means the death of the petrodollar. So the consequences in the future are for the exchange value of the US dollar and for the financing of American trade and budget deficits. So the US may begin having trouble for the first time since the end of World War II in financing its large and growing trade and budget deficits. As this movement away from using the dollar to settle international trade imbalances gathers momentum. You see, the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency, or has been the world reserve currency since the end of World War II, what it means is that all foreign central banks kept their reserves in the form of US Treasury debt. So there was never any problem with Washington financing his debt, because an increase in Washington's debt simply meant an increase in the world's bank reserves. So financing the debt was never a problem. Well, if the dollar loses this role, or this role diminishes, as it's obviously doing, then financing problems arise for the first time since the end of World War II. And in a way, Washington brought this on themselves with their sanctions, with their confiscation of Russian central bank assets, with their theft of Venezuela's gold. This taught all foreign central banks that the dollar was weaponized and dangerous. It's dangerous to hold reserves in dollars. And that if you hold reserve in dollars and don't want them confiscated, you have to be an American puppet state. You don't have any sovereignty. So Washington has created its own future financing problem. And now I think that's the reason we saw significant countries like Egypt, which sits on the Suez Canal, joining BRICS, the Saudi Arabians. I mean, who would have thought? And of course, the Iranians, the United Arab Emirates. I mean, this is a slap in Washington's face. And for countries to do that, they have to feel confident. So they must feel confident that association with Russia and China is protective.
You talk about the Suez Canal. We know that Egypt and Ethiopia are on the Red Sea that connects to the Suez Canal. What's the importance of this?
Well, it's a waterway that greatly shortens the trip. You know, you don't have to go around the Cape of Africa. You have to go all the way down one side of the continent and back up the other side. So it's an enormous, that's why it was built. It saves shipping time, expense. And if you have any kind of military action, access through the canal is of considerable importance.
The other point that they're making about this BRICS summit, they're talking about these new members of BRICS gonna make more arguments, more disagreement inside this coalition. Disagreements between China and India, now Saudi Arabia and Iran, that they are not totally in line with each other. Do you see as a point of strength or as a point of weakness, or they're learning how to work together?
Well, I imagine that they're all aware of their differences, but they seem to think that they're better off banding together than being subject to various attacks from the West or from Washington. And so it seems to me it's just a realization that whatever our differences are between us, they're not as great as our differences with Washington. And so we'll work them out. My own view is that where they're likely to have the most trouble is if they try to create a new currency, if they try to create a BRICS currency, which would consist of some weighted combination of all the currencies of the members, because that will cause them to fight over what weight their currency gets. And every country will want to have a strong weight, but not every country can justify it. I mean, you would think that the massive oil of Saudi Arabia and Russia would sort of dominate the weight. And then, of course, the massive manufacturing capability of China. So this sort of leaves a lot of the other countries with a small stake in the BRICS currency. So they would be better not to try to create a BRICS currency. They don't need one. They can keep the reserves in the currencies of their trading partners. People don't understand the reason there was a world reserve currency after World War II was that every other industrial economy except the United States was destroyed by the war. And so other countries did not have any backing for their currencies. But Washington was untouched by the war and grew even stronger as a manufacturing. And so it was so dominant that it was obvious the dollar would take this role because there was really no other country that had a currency because they didn't have an economy. Well, it's not true today. You know, Russia has enormous energy and agricultural potential. China has enormous industrial and manufacturing capability. All of these countries have something. So they all have a basis for their currency. And the countries that have the most responsible monetary policies will have strong currencies. And the ones who don't have responsible monetary policies will have weaker currencies. But there's always a currency. There's something, and they have something. So they can settle their differences in their own currencies. So if they just give up the notion that they have to have some kind of a reserve currency, it will help them. Now, I don't see any point of the conflict between India and China. It makes no sense to me why these two countries faced with Washington would be fighting over a few miles of territory along a border. It makes no sense. I would say it's almost idiotic. And I don't know why the Chinese would not see that getting along with India was far more important than whatever they're fighting about. In other words, I don't think the issue is worth either country fighting about it. Advantage of them being united is so much greater. And I really don't know why Putin doesn't really work on getting rid of the difference there between China and India. He ought to be meeting with them saying, look, this is ridiculous. How are we going to do anything if the two largest countries in the BRICS are disputing? But who knows? Humans are only occasionally irrational, thoughtful people. It's not the normal state of mankind. It's emotional and irrational. This is the real behavior of humans.
Yeah, as you mentioned, these differences between China it's ridiculous. Between China and India is ridiculous. And on the other hand, we have these differences between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In Yemen, especially in Yemen, they were fighting each other. And now they're putting their differences aside. They learned how to cooperate. They're literally normalizing their relations. And it was 2 months ago, they started talking to each other. And now they are part of BRICS. Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, UAE, these are huge producers of energy. On the other side, we have China and India that need tremendous amount of energy to work as an engine for their countries.
I will say something about your point about Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's not quite true they were fighting each other in Yemen. It is true that Saudi Arabia was representing Washington's interest in Yemen, not Saudi Arabia's interest. There's a difference, you see. We were using the Saudis against Iran, and why? In Yemen. Well, it was part of the neoconservatives' assault on the entirety of the Middle East. And, the reason we attacked Iraq and Libya and tried to attack Syria, and the reason that we overthrew Iraq and tried to overthrow Syria, and the reason we are so opposed to Iran is those are the three countries that fund the Hezbollah militia in southern Lebanon, which Israel wants. Israel wants southern Lebanon for the water resources there. And they twice moved in the Israeli army to occupy southern Lebanon, and the Hezbollah militia drove them out both times, essentially sent them running for their lives. Well, Israel, it doesn't want to risk another humiliation by being defeated by a militia. So it used the neoconservatives and that control American foreign policy to try to eliminate the countries that financed Hezbollah and that provided Hezbollah with weapons. And of course, Iraq, we took them out. And we were unsuccessful in Syria because the Russians blocked it. And we've not come to make the mistake so far of attacking Iran. So the neoconservatives failed to achieve Israel's goal for them. I think now it's too late for the United States to attack Iran because of the BRICS relationship. Now, for this relationship to really be successful, it needs to also become a military relationship. There needs to be a NATO version of BRICS to prevent the United States from trying to overthrow the individual governments. For example, if Argentina actually becomes a member, Argentina is vulnerable to being overthrown by Washington. And then Washington would put in their government in Argentina, and then they would withdraw from BRICS. So you can see why the BRICS need stabilization and not fights among themselves, because Washington's response may be to go after the governments in BRICS. You have to understand there's a large number of American bases in Saudi Arabia. And no doubt there's some dissident princes that they can install. Whether the United States has the capability of overthrowing the Saudi government, I don't know, but we have bases there. We have contacts. We certainly know of any dissident elements among the royal family, and there always are. There's always somebody that says, I should be there, not that guy. And there was some sort of upset when the latest version of the Saudi government took place. It was a form of an easy coup, not a dramatic thing, but So these kinds of opportunities may exist for Washington. So we can't really know, what its position is in these new countries.
We have a coup in Pakistan. Imran Khan was removed from power. He wanted to have good relations with Russia, China, and the United States at the same time, that it's not acceptable for the US.
Yeah, well, that is clearly what happened. He was moving Pakistan out from under American control, and we simply didn't permit it. So we had the military overthrow him. And now I think they're still trying to arrest him and prison him, and the same thing they do to Donald Trump. So, Donald Trump was trying to end the conflict between the United States and Russia. Well, as we've talked about before, this is a threat to the power and budget of the CIA and the American military security complex. Because if they don't have Russia as an enemy, why do they need $1,000 billion a year budget? And why do they need all of the sort of unconstitutional power that they exercise? So it's necessary for the American military security complex to have Russia as an enemy. And when Trump threatened that, they removed him and continue their assaults on him. So it's easy to understand, Pakistan. And it's the reason that I've given the other possibilities. Argentina could be overthrown. Saudi Arabia possibly could be overthrown. I don't know that we can overthrow Egypt. The United Arab Emirates is just a small place, and it just has like a ruler. So maybe we could overthrow them, which seem to be within the CIA's power and competence to overthrow the United Arab Emirates, and maybe Ethiopia as well. So if the members of BRICS don't realize that it's a precarious undertaking, BRICS could have setbacks. And I think that most of the world, of course not Europe or Great Britain or Canada or Australia or New Zealand and not the Japanese government, they're not willing to overthrow American influence over them. But I think the rest of the world has had enough of it. And it's Washington's fault because it has abused these countries and abused its power and abused the dollar or the dollar's use. And so I think the world would like to see a return of powers that can checkmate Washington, like the Soviet Union was able to do. When the Soviet Union was there, the Middle East was basically except for Saudi Arabia, free of American power because they could appeal to the Soviets. And the Soviets were there with the presence. This is why Israel was so important to Washington and why Israel gained so much power over Washington. It was a necessary anchor to have a presence against the Soviet influence. So these things will all continue. What the political awareness of the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians are, I don't know. I don't know if they're politically astute, if they understand the determination of the American neoconservatives to exercise hegemony over the world. I don't know if they understand that or just regard it as a silly idea. If they don't take it seriously, they'll be surprised by actions that will, at least to some extent, undermine their efforts to form up BRICS that's economically and politically powerful.
The Chinese Minister of Defense just 2 weeks ago, he was talking about a new alliance, military alliance between SCO countries, the SCO countries, Iran and Belarus.
You see, China is in the position that Japan was in the 1930s. Japan didn't have any energy. And the whole reason that the Japanese went to war against the United States and the British was that we forced them into it by curtailing their access to energy. So China obviously wants to be sure that we're not able to do that to China, and so they have this growing energy relationship with Russia and Iran, and there's a big Chinese stake in Iran. So for Iran, this means, well, look, we've got a major nuclear power that's dependent on our energy, and so this is comforting. You know, we don't have nuclear weapons and all that, but now we have a customer who essentially is an ally because China needs our energy. So this probably limits the willingness of the United States to attack Iran. So I've never understood why years ago Russia and China and Iran did not make a military alliance and just announce that we have a military alliance. Attack on one, attack on all. That would have certainly stopped all the Israeli machinations in Washington trying to get the United States to attack Iran, because it would mean we are now at the war with two major nuclear powers. We would have no chance of winning. So I don't understand. I think the trouble with the Russians, Chinese, is that they are excessively cautious, which is a good thing in a way, but it's a bad thing if it convinces Washington that they're not resolute. If Washington looks at this and says, well, they're not really serious, or they're not resolute, something they like to do, it gives the diplomats things to do, they can make trips, like there can be news conferences and all these things governments like, but you're not really very determined. If Washington takes that view of it, then it doesn't work for BRICS. They have to be convinced, hey, you know, we've created a bunch of enemies for ourselves, Washington has, and they're determined. And so we better figure out how to get out of this conflict before it evolves further. But that takes a lot of show of resolute behavior on the part of Russia and China and Iran and the rest of them. They have to show, look, we're serious. We've had enough of you. We're not tolerating it anymore. They can't just say that like Putin does. Putin says it. Lavrov says it. The Chinese leader says it, but they never do anything. And so it takes resolution, because in the absence of resolution, Washington, under the influence of the neoconservatives, will say, well, look, they're not really serious. Look, Putin is always talking, but he never acts. You know, Putin said some years ago, this is a direct quote, Russia will never again fight a war on its own territory. That's what he said. Well, for the last 18 months, where's the Ukrainian war been fought? On Russian territory. And now it's spreading, you know, drone attacks on Moscow. There's a Russian town not too far from Ukraine, but in Russia itself, of 50,000 people. It's been destroyed by the Ukrainians, evacuated. So you can't say that Russia will never again fight a war on its own territory and then spend 18 months fighting one on your territory. To me, it makes no sense, because what it tells me is, well, Washington will get more provocative. But Putin could stop these attacks. He could very easily take out Kiev. Well, this whole war, he's left Zelensky's government there untouched, able to continue fighting the war. Well, this is not the way you fight wars if you want to be taken seriously. And so if BRICS behaves in these same kinds of unintelligent ways, it will encourage the Americans to try to break it up. The CIA over the decades has shown a remarkable ability to overthrow governments and assassinate leaders. It's quite remarkable. And, South America is a graveyard of overthrown governments by the CIA. This is one after the other. Just think about how many times Washington overthrew Guatemala. Or try to think about a government we haven't overthrown. And so, to answer your question, is that the BRICS don't show resolution, and they start bickering and fighting over whose currency has the most weight in a BRICS currency, or if the Chinese and the Indians keep shooting each other over something that doesn't matter, then BRICS will have zero credibility.
In this BRICS summit, one thing was so strange. France was asking for invitation.
Maybe we wanted him to be there to see if he could disrupt things or to report things. Maybe France wants to realign in some ways. You know, France was the last European country to come into the American orbit. You know, de Gaulle despised the United States, and it was de Gaulle that forced Washington off of the gold standard because he demanded gold for his holdings of U.S. Treasury debt, and either we didn't want to give it or we didn't have it. And so Nixon had to go off the gold backing of the dollar in international transactions, which I think was something of a humiliation for Washington. So de Gaulle forced that. And then it was a long, long time after the formation of NATO that France ever joined it. I don't remember now the year. It was the last Western European country to join. And a long time, I think, afterwards. Maybe my memory's playing tricks on me, but you could look it up. I mean, it's easy to look up when France joined NATO. So there's always been some sort of a attitude in France to still be a sovereign country, even though they stupidly joined the European Union, because if you're in the European Union, you're not sovereign. And especially if you're in the European Union and you're also a Washington puppet, there's no sovereignty. But France has, of course, been hurt too by the Washington's animosity to Russia. Remember, we forced France off of a lucrative shipbuilding contract for the Russians. Basically, we forced them to violate law and terminate the contract, and they had to pay huge sums of penalties to Russia for violating the contract, and they had to close shipyards, and thousands of Frenchmen lost their jobs and their careers. And we did the same thing to the big French bank. We claimed that it financed some trading with Iran, I think it was. It may have been Russia, that we didn't want them to finance, that our sanctions prohibited. See, the Americans can prohibit France and Germany and Great Britain from trading with people. And these countries' governments go along with it. I mean, why? I mean, it's because they're bought and paid for. Washington owns them. Well, this hurt the bank. The bank had to pay a huge penalty to Washington. It almost broke the bank. They had to hand over billions of dollars to Washington simply because they financed some trade with Iran or Russia or somebody that Washington didn't approve of. Well, when people suffer like this under American oppression, they want to get out from under it. So it could be that Macron has sensed this and is trying to at least gain some independence or some leverage. But this is just speculation. I don't know. But I do know how things work, or tend to work within governments and all that. And so it's certainly plausible speculation. But I can't say that what I've said is the fact or the truth. I mean, it's just a possible explanation.
the other front of this war between United States on one side and Russia and China on the other side is in Africa. 34% of their infrastructure in Africa is getting built by Chinese, and activities of Wagner groups in Africa is so remarkable. How do you see this new confrontation of these superpowers?
The United States approach to Africa was military. It's the same approach we used in South America. Let us train your army. So we try to train the armies and gain influence in that way. The Chinese said, let us make you better off. And the Americans say, hey, take this loan from us. And once you find you can't repay it, you'll have to hand over to us all of your valuable minerals or farmland. So the United States takes an exploitative economic approach to Africa and tries to control them by training the armies. Whereas China says, we don't train the armies, but look, let us help you. Let us make you richer. The Africans prefer China. Moreover, they have learned, so many of them have been overthrown. Popular leaders we overthrew. And so if you're an African leader, you always sit there wondering, what might I do that annoys the Americans so they overthrow me? How can I avoid antagonizing the Americans? Plus, all of your competitors know that they can appeal to America by agreeing to do what America wants. So if there's an African leader, he's caught. He can antagonize the Americans by not doing what they want, but his competitors can appeal to the Americans and say, we will do more of what you want than he will. And so they've all been precarious. Well, it's not any fun to be a ruler when you're not really the ruler. Washington is the ruler. And so I think they see Chinese presence as shoring up their own stability. And I think they look at the Russians the same way. And I think if they can look to Russia as a source of energy and a source of food, then the two critical things that we could cut them off from can't be cut off. So I don't think that Washington will win this, because it's not in the Africans' interest. And I don't know any of the background of the coup, they call it, in Niger. It seems like France has had to leave, and it seems that the French presence there was it was apparently part of the old French African colonies, and the French presence is a way of having an American hold on it. So it looks to me like China and Russia are enough of a counterbalance to the United States that countries are feeling more secure in moving away from Washington. Now, of course, that infuriates Washington. And so we have the efforts directed against Russia and China. So we'll use Taiwan and the Japanese to try to discombobulate China, just as we've used Ukraine against Russia. I don't think that these tactics will work, but it really, again, comes back to how resolute the BRICS are and how aware they are of their vulnerability.
Do you think that Washington would be able to convince Taiwanese to go against China?
Yeah, my own view is that China is probably taking Taiwan through economic integration. And they chose that way over military means. And what is angering Chinese is the United States is trying to go back on the policy the United States itself introduced, the one China policy. I think this was the Nixon administration. This is one of Nixon's great accomplishments. You see, it's really the reason the CIA overthrew Nixon. The Americans are unaware, but Watergate was a CIA plot to remove Nixon. Why? Because he was mending relations with China. And the big way he did that was by saying there's a one China policy, and we removed Taiwan from the United Nations Security Council and allowed China to take the place. So this made Nixon persona non grata with the CIA, and also Nixon was making all sorts of arms limitation agreements with the Soviets, the SALT I and SALT II and the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And this was very disturbing to the CIA and the military security complex, because it was sort of downgrading the Soviet Union as an enemy. And we've already talked about the need of CIA, the military security complex, for an enemy. They need an enemy for their budget and their power. And Kennedy, John Kennedy, the president, previously to Nixon, was doing the same thing. He was working with Khrushchev behind the scenes to defuse the dangerous relationships that had led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this was not acceptable to the military security complex, so they assassinated him. And they cooked up some story about Oswald, which is totally unbelievable. But they couldn't assassinate Nixon physically like they did Kennedy, because there was too much suspicion about Kennedy's assassination. And they didn't want to risk deepening it and having another. So they concocted this Watergate scheme. And it was actually carried on by one of their own operatives that they sent to the Washington Post to write the stories.
We had this GOP debate. How did you see these candidates? We have Ron DeSantis. He's not growing in the polls.
Well, none of these would-be candidates have any public support. None of them could be elected. The Trump people want Trump. The American people, the majority of those who vote, want Trump, period. They won't have anybody else. So, and furthermore, it's not a debate. They didn't have a debate. There's no longer political debates. No, the Americans don't have political debates. Basically, what these get-togethers are is each candidate gets to stand up and say what interest groups he's going to look after, hoping to get funding from the interest groups that he's going to do things for. And the one who's talking about making deals with Russia and China, he's just going to alienate the military security complex, and of course wouldn't get anything. But none of them could win. The public, as all the polls show, want Trump. And Trump says, I don't even need to go to the debates because the people have already chosen me. And if they hadn't already chosen me, I wouldn't be indicted 4 times. The whole reason for these indictments is to try to keep me from running. And that's the only reason for them. There's no basis. There's no legal basis for any of these indictments. They're all propaganda attempts by the Democrats to keep Trump from running because they know they can't defeat him. If they could defeat him, they wouldn't bother with any of this. They're making fools of themselves. You have two of the prosecutors can't even explain what the indictments are because there's no basis in law for them. And the Department of Justice dimwit is constantly being overruled by the judges. He's so incompetent. He can't even make his filings without making mistakes. And the other day, a federal judge asked him, hey, could you please explain how you're trying Trump on Florida charges in Washington, D.C. with an all-Democrat jury? Well, that's a good question. If the charges are Florida charges, they're going to be trying Georgia in Florida. Oh, but he wanted a Democrat in Washington. There's nothing but Democrats. So all the jurors will be Trump-hating Democrats. So he's going to try the guy on charges in this state in the District of Columbia. Well, look, this goes beyond incompetence. This is fraud. Well, when a U.S. attorney gets so brutally corrected by a judge, he should resign. He doesn't belong there. He's not capable. He has no integrity. So I think the people see this, so they don't know whether the Democrats are going to be able to put Trump in jail or not, but I don't think the people will accept it. And they expect him to be the president. All the polls show every time he gets another indictment, his support goes up.
Is he going to survive all these indictments?
Yeah. Every new indictment, whoop, goes his support up higher and higher and higher. It's so high now. I mean, if the election was right now, I mean, it would be like every vote we go to Trump. I mean, there's no chance of Biden winning a fair election. And so what do we see happening now? So what is happening now, they know this. The Democrats, they know they cannot win the election. They're not confident they're going to be able to convict Trump, even with rigged juries, or if they do, they won't be able to make the conviction stand because they'll be appealed and they'll reach at some level an honest court. And so even if they get him convicted, it'll be overturned and the whole thing will collapse on them and they'll be ruined. And so what are they doing? The states that are controlled by Democrats, the so-called blue states, are now removing Trump's name from the ballot. They're passing laws that he can't run. They're so terrified. In fact, they're so totally convinced that they're going to lose, flatly be wiped out in the election, that they're taking the name of Trump off the ballot so he can't even run in those states. Well, this is not legal, but they're doing it anyhow. Who's going to stop them? The government's in their hands in Washington. The Justice Department is totally corrupt. I mean, it's probably the most corrupt Justice Department on the face of the earth. And I really believe that. And so does a lot of people. So why are they doing all of this? Why don't they let the American people decide in a fair election whether Trump is guilty or not? Why do they insist that a handful of Democrat jurors who hate Trump make the decision? Why don't they let the American people make the decision? Okay, he's running. Here's our case against him. Are you going to vote for him anyhow? Let the people decide. That's what a real democracy would do. But the United States isn't a democracy, and the Democrats are determined to establish one-party rule. And the so-called rhino Republicans, they're on the Democrat side because they don't want Trump either, because they're part of the establishment and Trump is a threat to the establishment. So they want to get rid of him. In other words, neither party wants the people to have a leader because the leader won't follow the establishment's rules. It'll follow the people's rules. And that's unacceptable in the United States. That's the whole reason Trump's had, what now, 7 years of false accusations, Russiagate, 2 fake impeachments, Strippergate, Documentsgate, and now 4 fake indictments. Well, clearly, the Democrats are desperate. The establishment is desperate. Don't let Trump in again. He doesn't represent us. He represents the people. We can't have that. That's all this is about, Nima. It's not about anything else. Democracy long ago disappeared in the United States, and Trump was trying to bring it back, and they're not going to let him. So the question is, if all of this fails, like Russiagate failed, the impeachments failed, the January 6th so-called insurrection failed, all these things fail, what are they going to do next? They're going to assassinate him. Just the other day, Tucker Carlson, our most courageous media voice, said they've done everything. It's not working, so they'll kill him. They're going to kill him. So that's also my prediction. Now, it may be they'll be able to get him convicted with the help of Republican rhino senators like Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican minority leader in the Senate. And there's a whole bunch of these useless Republicans, and they may all help the Democrats convict Trump, but then we're faced with a policy of appeal. And if Trump actually gets put in a prison, the country will be split in two and will never be put back together again. There'll be permanent disunity among the American population. And there'll be a form of hatred that is extremely intense, because most, not all, but most of ordinary Americans still have a sense of justice. And they're watching the most unjust thing they can imagine. They don't expect it to work because they think there's something still good about their country. I'm not sure they're correct that there's still something good about the country, other than they themselves. They'll wait to see what happens. They won't take action before. The most likely outcome is all this will blow away simply because the Democrats realize it's too obvious, or even the corrupt Democrat judges won't be willing to let an invalid prosecution go forward. That's always possible too, because the judge has to think, what if it doesn't work? I'm ruined. Do I really want to participate in such a total overthrow of the United States Constitution? What if this doesn't work? How do I want to be remembered in this way? You can't tell what eventually happens. Even corrupt people at some point can lose confidence. I can't predict, that they're going to lose confidence, but there's always a possibility at some point that is, you see, right now, the law schools, the bar associations, they're not saying anything because they don't like Trump. But how do you have a rule of law if you let your emotions, not facts, decide the outcome? And if you institutionalize a system of justice in which emotion rules, not facts, then it can be used against any and everybody. And so I have a very poor opinion of American law schools and American universities. I've been in a lot of universities. I have an extremely low opinion of their integrity, of their scholarship. The same about law schools. And so it may be it'll never occur to them that they're destroying the rule of law. Or maybe they think they aren't, that this is just a one-time thing. But of course, it's not a one-time. It's a precedent. It institutionalizes conviction based on personal emotions. Well, that's not law. It may dawn on them they're destroying a rule of law. Well, anyhow, again, as I say, this is just my thoughts, my speculation about all this. It makes me ashamed of being an American, how the rest of the world looks at this and sees this. This is just like, for years it's been true in South America. The incoming president arrests the outgoing president. That cheap two-bit punk that America installed in Ecuador after Rafael Carrera's term was over, that we had take back Julian Assange's Ecuadorian asylum and citizenship. Well, he tried to arrest Rafael Carrera. And I think right now, another something like that's going on in a South American country. It just goes on all the time. Well, how do you have a government? It's like two mafia gangs fighting over the territory. This is not government. The people don't benefit. So, well, we'll see what happens.